Good afternoon, everybody. I'm happy to see you, and thank you for attending the live Zoom session. And remember, they're all recorded as well. This is the second to the last live session. And then, most of your work will be done on Canvas, but I really encourage you to email me whenever you have a question or you want additional resources through the Canvas system because I get them directly. Also, I'd like to say that what I've been reading in Module 1, and I'm only focusing on Module 1, so that I don't have to keep going back and forth, back and forth. I've looked at Module 1 and Module 2, but the things that I've seen in Module 1 really show the commitment to being really thorough and complete in responding and reading other people's posts. And so, I really appreciate your efforts. It's really important that these opportunities are developed in a way that you become more skillful as an interpreter, and you end up, really developing your own goals for being a better interpreter. I just today talked with someone he's the one who's over purchasing. His name is Adam Hurd. He's a very nice guy at the state board. And he's the one who's developing the contract for the advanced course, which again, is an opportunity. After completing level 1, you can then apply for the advanced coursework so that you can, and with hope of the people who are supporting you, you can take this course and adapt it so that you will be able to do what I do, which is, train other trainers for a level 1 certificate in your schools and in your district, however that works for you. So again, we have to really thank and be appreciative for Leah Voorhees, who supported the development funding that is going to the level 2 or the advanced certification. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to pause for a minute to see if you have any clarifying questions. And remember, in the Canvas course, if I don't see any responses, I'll email you and say, do you have questions about the course, about Canvas, about what you're doing, so that it's a way for me to let you know that every week, usually on Friday, sometimes on Wednesdays, so that I can make comments or bring up reminders for you. And the reason this is important is I want you to know how committed I am to your learning. And I'm only focusing again on Module 1 and 2 because otherwise I have to keep on coming back. We have, out of the 117 applicants, we only have 70 of those who have actually used all the information to register for the Canvas course. So I'm hoping that, people have been busy and they haven't had a chance to register, because it would be really important if, we could get as many as, at least 50 or 60, hopefully 80% of those who applied to actually register for the Canvas course and to finish it, very successfully. So before I go on, today we're going to do a brief review of the standards that we talked about the last week. And then we'll go to the next ones. And remember, this is the second to the last session of live Zoom meetings. So we'll have this one and then we'll have one more after that. So before I share my screen so we can review the standards and then look at the new one, the ones that are coming up in the next part of the standards with the objectives, does anybody have any comments or questions? Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. And again, you can just either raise your hand or talk out because I can see it while I'm sharing my screen. And you have to let me know if you can actually see the screen. Okay, good.
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Thank you. So again, there are 46 objectives under the 8 standards. And again, the reason we're focusing on the standards and embedding them in the Zoom as well as the Canvas course, is that this is USBE's attempt to provide the kind of technical assistance to all the 42 districts and the 137 charter schools with really honoring the diverse language communities that Utah has the benefit of um, welcoming into, the sense of belonging and participation that we want from families uh, for engaging their students in the best academic education possible. So uh, that's again the purposes. There are 46 objectives, and remember the objectives are the ones that are underneath the standards with the ethical principle. So, and we talked about these before, but just in case you missed it or haven't had a chance to actually go to the recordings, the first one again is what um, the YouTube video really talks about. It's accuracy and fidelity in relationship to, to the best of, your ability without adding or misrepresenting or omitting or increasing the meaning of what is communicated, to really accurately interpret as faithfully as possible what usually it's the administrator or it's the family is actually saying. And we talked about this in all kinds of levels in relationship to, being able to um, kind of read the actual experience of kind of the nonverbals so that we're not like overstepping and what is our actual role. So that was the first one we talked about. And then of course, when you look at the ethical principle and then you look at the objectives that are oriented toward preserving the meaning, you would actually in the Canvas course identify those objectives that you feel really strongly about, that you are doing the best of your ability, you're really communicating with fidelity and accuracy, and any of the objectives, one or more, that you really want to work on. So by the time you finish, you'll end up having, maybe 8 objectives that you feel very confident about, and 8 objectives that, and maybe more, that you want to work on, that you want to focus on. Not as it's a failing or anything like that, but actually setting a goal for yourself to become more skilled and more expert in something that you want to set as a goal. Most of the research shows whatever we pay attention to is what we achieve. And so if we actually set out a goal for ourselves with reminders and how we check in with other people, it ends up, benefiting us. And then the second standard that we went over last week was about confidentiality. And again, this goes back not only to this idea of privacy, but also the legal obligations of FERPA. And, USBE has a privacy officer. The state legislature has a privacy officer because of social media and the implications for abusing social media, whether it's calling people out or sharing pictures without the person's permission or whatever it happens to be, that confidentiality is really critical. And really ensuring that there isn't any kind of disclosure of information that you learn is spoken in the meeting or is written at all. So, the whole goal really is to make sure that the privacy of the family and the student is protected. That's the second standard. So the third standard is about, and we had some great conversations about this, which is for me also very challenging if you're an advocate for families and children. It's to be completely impartial, which is a real challenge because the interpreter cannot show preference or bias to any party involved in the encounter, the situation. It means, which again, it's a challenge. But the interpreter has to even inform all parties of their duty to remain impartial. And that if there is, a personal interest in the outcome, you might decline to interpret. Now, this came up last week. The question ends up being, well, as an interpreter, should I not interpret? Well, you have to actually learn to be skillful in relationship to doing the first standard really with integrity, which is to explain and communicate clearly with fidelity what is actually being said, right, by both parties. So we talked a lot about that and the relationship of being an advocate, but also realizing that the only way people learn to get along is that if you're interpreting exactly what they're saying, and if either one of the parties senses some kind of miscommunication, then, it's your obligation to say, are you understanding this? Is this clear? How else can this be said? The next one, which we didn't cover, so we're going to talk a little bit more about this one and the objectives. And so this, seems like a really obvious one: respect for persons. Interpreters demonstrate respect toward all parties involved in the interpreter encounter. Now, this is interesting because sometimes people will say things that are patently wrong, especially when you consider your knowledge of HB 302. And part of the problem would be, actually maintaining your respect for that person despite their not being knowledgeable enough to understand what the state law says. So this ends up being, a pretty big challenge because you're going to find yourself in positions where you're much more knowledgeable than maybe a teacher or an administrator or a counselor or a social worker or whatever. And so the question always ends up being, you being clear that you're an interpreter who understands HB 302 and the obligation for families to have access to languages that they understand to benefit their students' education. So here it is: demonstration and acknowledgement of the inherent dignity of all parties. So sometimes if people get triggered by something that somebody else says, or they think they understand the meaning, and their, voice might change, their, kind of whole demeanor might show that whatever's being said is not really respected. So this is, and I'll just say this honestly, this is a challenge for me as well. When there are people who are advocating segregation of newcomer students to their detriment, besides being incredibly misunderstanding of the law, not understanding not only Supreme Court case law, OCR law, but state law, it ends up being frustrating for me. So for me, this piece is a challenge if people are either don't know or unwilling to actually better understand their legal obligations. And it ends up being a challenge. The next standard is maintaining role boundaries. This fits in really well with the one above it. See, it says the objective here, which is the one above it, which is about respect for all persons, the interpreter promotes direct communication, right? So again, it goes back to this idea of fidelity. You're not adding things and explaining things because you think someone's not understanding. You have to actually make it clear to the person who's speaking that you know they need to be clear because the person isn't understanding. So the interpreter engages in behavior that promotes autonomy and personal choice of the individuals involved. So this is the other thing again, which is, really challenging because if you're respecting the dignity of another person, then it actually means that they also have the right to make choices. This actually came up, and I want to apologize who brought this up last week. I think it was last week. I did email the USBE special ed person about the end of an IEP, where all of a sudden the person is saying to the family that their child doesn't qualify for extended learning, like a summer program or an after-school program. So the person that I emailed was not available, and she hasn't gotten back to me because she's out of town. But I hope to get this answered for you because the question ends up being, when a situation like that comes up and the family's trying to understand why they're not allowed to make a choice about their child attending, extended learning, the question becomes, well, then who does get the chance and the opportunity for that? And how is the criteria determined to develop an eligibility criteria that applies to certain students and not other students? So this piece again is important, related to respect of people's choices, and then creating an environment where the families do have choice instead of being dictated to. Again, the next one is maintaining role boundaries. So the ethical principle is interpreters strive to perform their professional duties within their prescribed role. Again, this is challenging, related to the one about showing preference and bias to a certain perspective and refraining from personal involvement. So the reason this is challenging is oftentimes the best opportunities for solving issues is to have a personal relationship with the families, right? So the question is, yes, you can have personal relationships with families, but when you're interpreting, your responsibility is about your professional duties as an interpreter in the role that you're serving at the moment in this interaction. Doesn't mean that you can't have personal relationships with families. That's not what this is saying. It's saying that you maintain your role and boundaries of professionalism in the context of your interpretation of what you're interpreting and how you're interpreting. Does anyone have any comments about this? Because I know this is challenging.
Hi, this is Sonia from Alpine School District and in Orem. Well, and actually American Fork. But anyway, as you are saying this standard, Dr. Strada, it brought to mind, and sorry, this isn't really this particular experience, but it's in relation to what you're saying. But the experience I was asked to interpret for a dear family that are very good friends of mine, and it was legal, it was with their attorney. And anyway, and I had this wonderful relationship with this family. And apparently the family was wrongfully, just to give you some context, the family was wrongfully evicted from an apartment complex. And they were a McKinney-Vento family. And it ended up being that they, long story short, won their lawsuit case because it was under discrimination. But the attorney specifically asked me to interpret and just say exactly what he was saying. And he told me, be sure not to put in your feelings, be sure not to, add anything else, et cetera, et cetera. During the interpretation, the family asked me, because they really trust me, because we've got a great relationship. And they asked me, Sonia, what should we do? And I told them, I'm sorry, I cannot give you any opinion, any advice. I am strictly here as your attorney requested for me to strictly just interpret for you. So therefore, I'm just sorry, I can't give you any input. I can't give you my opinion or anything like that. So I couldn't help but think of that experience I had when you are reading these things, because I've got to maintain the integrity of the professional role that I was playing, and that I was also asked to maintain or just to interpret for the need that we had.
Yeah, Sonia, thank you for sharing that experience. So that this is like a really, really excellent example of what happens in situations where there is kind of a high stakes environment,
Mhm.
whether it's legal, or it has to do with issues of behavior, all those kinds of things. And the fact that the lawyer actually was very clear with you, really was beneficial. Um, because again, it goes back to this and the fact that you could explain it because you understood clearly what the expectation was. So the other thing is if you're asked to interpret and it's just a kind of a high possibility of a conflict or a serious situation, it's important to clarify that you understand your role as an interpreter and that you clarify that with the person you're interpreting for. So, this is a really great example, Sonia. I really appreciate it. And I know it's an incredible challenge because there's so many things that happen that are just, that are completely unjust, and people in different positions take advantage of other people that they perceive as not having as much political power or whatever their perceptions are. So thank you for sharing that.
My
Uh,
pleasure.
you're welcome. So let's look at again, it's protection of professional integrity. Um, see, this is the other part of it where it says reduction of exposure to liability. So you don't want to be liable for mitigating an outcome that ends up putting your professional role in jeopardy, right? So this whole thing is the maintenance of your own emotional well-being and your safety as an interpreter. You don't want to be caught in a situation where you're accused as the interpreter of either taking sides or explaining beyond your role, which is really important. So it's a legal issue as well, and a maintenance of your professional role. So communication between parties who speak on their own behalf and make their own decisions. So if you had this, so one thing that might be interesting, this is your syllabus, if you downloaded it and you highlighted in yellow the things that you have to remind yourself of. For me, this one would be really important, to speak on their own behalf and make their own decisions. So it's about each party speaking in their self-interest and making their own decisions. It's not about you influencing how that conversation, that communication happens, because you feel that one is being disadvantaged over another. So you have to be very careful about that. I think about it as a way, I'll give you a kind of a concrete example of a meeting that I had today. I'm not going to mention any names. But they were talking about a program they wanted to develop. For me, it was very clear that it was against state and federal law. It was pretty clear to me. So it was a challenge for me to say to them, well, let me point out to you a couple of things based on what you're thinking about developing this program, because other districts have done these kinds of things and then have ended up being under OCR. So that was one way to actually help them see the implications of the decisions that they pretty much had already made that would lead them down to a path that would not be good for the children, the families, or even the district. So, but they have to make those decisions. So I said to them, I'm going to give you all these resources and connect you to people to have that are in districts who have gone through this experience and how they've resolved it. And, it's important for you to have, all the resources that you need. I made the comment about HB 302 and HB 230 about registration policies. But again, I can only give them the resources and communicate to them the kind of knowledge that would help them benefit their students and their families and keep them safe from, legal troubles. But when they make those decisions, they're making them. I'm not telling them what they should be. They should do. It's like Sonia, who said, she can't give her opinion about what they should be doing. But I can give them resources and help them to consider all the alternatives in relationship to the program they want to design. And to keep them, from being liable with any violation of federal or state law. Again, it goes back to the objective 21. The interpreter does not advocate on behalf of any party. This whole issue of advocacy is really critical. For me, it's a challenge, right? Because, I work for the children of Utah and their families. And so when there's miscommunication or misunderstanding or whatever it happens to be, then it ends up being like an incredible challenge. When there's an internal audit complaint and it's against someone that I have a personal relationship with and I know very well, and I've been in their school and know their values, I can't go to them and protect them based on a complaint. It has to go through the proper procedure so that the complaint is resolved, but not with me in the middle of it, which ends up, always being a challenge because usually those internal audit complaints come to me. So it's a challenge for me not to let my relationships with principals and teachers or districts interfere with determining the outcome of the complaint. So it goes back to this thing about not entering a discussion, not giving advice, expressing personal opinions. And, that's that ends up just being a challenge for all of us, right? The interpreter does not filter, communication, mediate, or speak on behalf of any party. Again, it's saying the same thing, but just a little nuanced. It's a challenge as an interpreter because you're listening to what they're trying to communicate, right? And so the temptation is to speak on behalf of the party and mediate what they're saying so that because you actually know kind of what the education people are expecting that they want to hear, right? Which might be different than what is being communicated. Again, the interpreter avoids unnecessary contact with parties. Prior to the encounter, the interpreter may initiate contact to ensure understanding of the language, to confirm details of an appointment, to convey any information about the encounter needed by the non-English speaker. So this goes to, your actual organization skills and what you need to do, which you would actually clear with the administrator or the education aspect and say, what do you think about contacting them to ensure and confirm the details of the appointment? They might have already organized it. And so you check with them. Because one of the issues that ends up creating problems is when there's miscommunication and the family misses the appointment or doesn't show up or is late or whatever it is, then that communicates something to the education people, whose tendency is more to be, in some sense, bureaucratic. And so the way in which they interpret that might be to, end up not being in any way more approachable to the family because of the family's misunderstanding of the technical aspects of meeting. Again, the interpreter does not perform services other than interpretation for any party. The interpreter utilizes the least obtrusive mode of interpretation, right? So you're not like in the middle of the conversation. Interpreter protects her and his own privacy, well-being, and safety. So the reason this is important is, you're taking on, as an interpreter, a huge responsibility, and it'll be emotional. And you have to actually, if you want to continue being an interpreter, then you have to actually protect yourself and your own well-being, so that you can be available for your family and the things that you love and give you energy. Because, I'm saying this for myself as well, even though I'm not an interpreter. When I have meetings between families and districts and there's conflict, or between an agency and a district, or, someone who is trying to develop something and they're misunderstanding either the criteria or the purposes. So it ends up being emotionally draining, especially if it's an outside agency asking for my help because they're advocating for a child and their family. So you have to make sure that you have the kind of energy that you protect yourself and your own privacy in relationship to continuing the work that's so vital to our families and our students who speak other languages other than English. Because that's a benefit. That's a benefit to Utah when you have multiple languages spoken in the state for so many reasons, economically, and the opportunity for, advanced education depends on how we interpret so that families are engaged in the education of their child and have every single opportunity for achievement and advancement after high school. Okay, the next module is accountability. Interpreters are responsible for the quality of their interpretation, provided accountable to all parties, the organizations that are engaging the interpreters' services. And so this is, this goes along with everything that we've talked about. Accountability means you have a sense of responsibility for the quality of your work, which goes back to this idea of you looking at the standards and the objectives in the modules on Canvas and determining what you want to work on, what you're good at and how you can help other colleagues, and what you want to work on to become better. Now, this is about developing your own skill and setting goals for your ongoing professional learning. Accountability, again, maintaining role boundaries and standards, adherence to laws and standards. And now you have a kind of a really good feeling for the standards, the national standards, as well as, state law. I probably, and I'm not sure if I've done it, but in the Canvas section, I'll actually make sure that there are links so that you can go to the Title III webpage and look at all the resources that are there. There's the legislation that's there. There are models and toolkits for newcomer students, for family engagement, for a competency-based program for teachers, so they can set their own goals and help students set goals for themselves based on, the students understanding what they need to work on, their own self-assessment. the way in which funding is allocated and what's allowable and what's not. So you become, really a well-educated and well-informed citizen that can actually do the interpretation for the benefit of students in their own educational experiences related to what the Department of Justice calls the responsibility of districts and charters for ensuring that all students learning English have access to not only grade level content, but high quality educational experiences that are provided for those students who are native English speakers. The interpreter identifies, corrects interpretation errors as soon as possible. So this also, ends up being a challenge because you have to be really alert when there's some kind of error or misspeaking something that's intended. You can generally tell based on the responses and the nonverbal experiences of the people that you're translating for. Right. So, if you have to check to see if they've understood how you've interpreted, and if it's an error and they don't understand it, then, you have to actually kind of own up to it. And again, this goes back to a really interesting thing about the professionalism of the interpreter. If the interpretation requires knowledge or skills beyond what you feel is that you're competent, then, you have to either suggest another interpreter or you have to say, my knowledge doesn't go that far, so how can I learn more about this so that I can interpret more skillfully and with competence and, being the professional that I am, how can I learn more so that I can be more effective? Again, the interpreter informs parties immediately, requests direction during an encounter if it becomes apparent that there's, something that is beyond your understanding, which is, incredibly challenging and it's humbling as well. So, I mean, if you don't understand something in the way in which, because, educational context and as you know, from the IEP language and also Title III language, it ends up being an incredible challenge if you're not understanding clearly what the educational language is and how to interpret it clearly for the family, so they actually better understand how they can support their child. The interpreter conducts himself in compliance with legislative requirements, accepted standards of the profession, maintains transparency. This I think is really important. You could highlight this in yellow. When clarification is necessary, I, the interpreter, need clarification on this, right? So this is a really important sentence stem that will help you if you feel like you're not really understanding what's being said. The interpreter brings to the attention of an appropriate person anything that impedes the compliance with any standard. Not limited to, again, conflict of interest, if you're tired, your inability to hear, or inadequate knowledge of, specialized terminology as an IEP. So we're going to stop there for today. Next week, we'll do the professionalism standard, and that'll be the last one. So I'm going to stop sharing and open it up to questions or sharing experiences that you've had that remind you of any of these standards, or if you have questions in general, or comments about the module or the expectations, anything that is any question that will help you, actually be successful in attaining your interpreter certification. I think the
So
other,
I just have if I can make a comment
sure.
on
Good.
that. Um, I remember when you said it can be very humbling. For example, the first time that I had to interpret for an IEP, it was a completely different ballgame, right? It was talk about a humbling experience. Someone that I thought, oh yeah, this is easy. I can do this, and I go there, and it's like, oh my gosh, what did I get myself into? That was very humbling. One of the things that I had to do, because there were terms that I didn't know, I had to stop and ask, what that meant, and then try to explain that to the parents. But so with that experience, then I found myself having to do my research and try to ask for more IEPs where I could get terms and be able to get those under context, right? And educational context and do that. But yeah, it is very humbling to interpret, especially in in the educational setting. It's a completely new language per se. Yeah.
Liz, thank you so much. I love your name. It means light, isn't it?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Uh, yeah, educational language is really it's so technical, and each context is different. If you're talking with someone in a family and a resource officer or whatever, then it ends up even being more complicated because because of the terms related to education policy as well as, legal issues, so it's not only IEPs, but it's the way in which language in different fields is shaped toward the educational context. And it has, an entire vocabulary of its own. I mean, one example is in federal law, they have this, it's called Language Instructional Education Program. And all it means is language services. But in the law, it has this huge acronym that nobody really uses or understands. And so if someone is using it and you don't really realize that it just means what kind of language services program do you have, right? It ends up being really challenging. So those are some the other term that's in the joint letter from the Department of Justice and the Department of Education is segregative environments. Now, if you look up the word segregative, you're not going to be able to find it very well. But what it means is that children who are English learners shouldn't be unnecessarily segregated with all the other students who are English learners, so they don't have an opportunity to acquire language in other courses. That often happens in high schools. Usually high school schedules, and I don't have anything against students who take advanced placement. I was an advanced placement teacher, an AP teacher. But generally, the high schools do their master's schedule based on how the advanced placement students have access to all their courses. So if they're taking 2 or 3 courses. So that ends up limiting the options for all the students who are not in advanced courses. So it's all these really strange examples of ways in which a system, if we don't understand the system, could ensure that students speaking English don't have access to the same educational experiences that a student who is a native English speaker. But if we don't know that, it ends up being challenging. I've had so many focus groups where families do not want their children in dual language immersion programs because they want them to learn English. but they don't understand, and no one explains to them, unfortunately, during registration, that if their student is literate in their first language, they end up achieving English much faster than if they were segregated out and put in all ELD classes. I mean, no one explains that to them. So how can the family and the student make the best educational decisions for their child when they're meeting with the counselor, or when the child comes home and shows them how they're programmed into low-level courses? Right? So it ends up being this incredible challenge for all of us. Griselda.
Yes, to add to Lu's comment that the words in IEPs like disability and delay, I've had even parents like cry to me and tell me, oh, so you mean my kid's not going to be normal, or you know, things like that. And it was, now that I have my training, you know, I used to always like say like, well, mom is saying, or mom's concerned about this. But yes, definitely the wording. I feel that sometimes parents can have a deeper concern when they hear disability, delay, you know, because you are only to translate the word that we may use for us as something more normal, like in our school system. Oh, they're just a little delayed. But to a parent to hear that word is a little bit more shocking. So yes, I also had a little bit of an awakening with realizing that the wording sometimes can scare the parents.
Yeah, I think this is a really important important thing that you're saying, because again, it goes back to this idea of how we actually interpret, how we understand the educational language and how we interpret directly, but then we have to you have to actually see if the parent actually is understanding what that means, which then is the responsibility of the educator, the special educator, or the administrator, whoever's leading the meeting, to be the one that clarifies, right? So it ends up being frightening for families. I mean, it's very disturbing. There was this interesting, it was a long time ago, but I happened to be in a Catholic parish. I was there visiting a friend, and it was the first time that Navajo had been translated in a written form that was connected to the saying of the Catholic Mass. And I was sitting in a room with all of my Navajo friends, and there was a priest who was actually reading Navajo and doing a pretty bad job of it. And my Navajo friends they're very polite. They would look at each other and they would say things like, oh, I'm not sure that means that. I don't think that means that. You know, and so it ends up going back to this idea of how language, especially oral language from different cultural experiences, can be shaped that is not connected to the meaning of what the educational context is trying to communicate. Right. I mean, that ends up being an incredible challenge. And of course, we want the parents to understand and not be frightened. And so it ends up being, for the interpreter, you know, a challenge to actually make sure that communication, what's being communicated, is done faithfully with fidelity and with confidentiality and respect. You know, and that means that we have to be, again, I mean, even when I'm thinking about it, I'm getting exhausted because it's exhausting, right? And so you have to actually take care of yourself if you want to be someone who interprets with fidelity to ensure that the best outcome, or the outcome that's trying to be communicated, you know, is understood by the family. And then, I mean, you know, we're not even talking about the way in which the family is going to communicate with the child, right? I mean, that's beyond the role of the interpreter. Other questions or observation? And thank you for sharing these, because these are really excellent examples of what the challenges are that I think oftentimes people in education have no idea. I mean, they have no idea how challenging being an interpreter is. And they don't even know the standards, frankly. And it's nobody's fault, right? It's just we have the benefit of legislation where every single district has to have a language access policy, period. It's just state law. So then we have to get people on board to help them better understand what that means. Liz, did you want to say something more?
Yes, yes, I do. So I just appreciate the comment that you made that it is the teacher or the special ed people to clarify those things, right? Sometimes, again, we've been talking a lot about the many hats that sometimes we wear in the educational system, but if we're interpreting, I think for me that comment it's great, right? Because then that responsibility doesn't fall on me, it falls on the experts per se on that, and not me as an interpreter to explain to the parents what, for example, what Griselda said, the what it means to be delayed or any of those other terms. So that's their responsibility. So I appreciate that reminder that it's not our responsibility to clarify any of that.
Yeah, that's right. In my book, you're kind of like all of you who are doing this, you're superheroes, because you have to do multiple things at the same time, right? You have to be thinking about what's being communicated and you being faithful to that, but not assuming the total responsibility of the understanding that happens in this kind of educational setting where there's technical vocabulary that's being thrown out by the educator and the family has no idea what's going on. So thank you for sharing that. So we have about 8 more minutes if anyone wants to share or ask questions or comments about how this has been helpful. I must admit, next week will be our last time and I will miss seeing you. But, having 2 meetings, one at 4 and one at 7, I'm not a spring chicken. I'm not 21. So this is a fabulous experience for me, one of the best experiences. I've been in education longer than most of you have ever been alive. And this has been like the premier experience of a long educational career, where I see people who are committed to the lives of children, and that makes me very happy. So I just want to thank you so much for your commitment.
And we all thank you as well for your time and helping us understand our better role as an interpreter.
Well, you're welcome. Take care and enjoy your week. I'll see you next week.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.